The following is a production of the Leonine Institute for Catholic Social Teaching. For more information, please visit leoinstitute.org. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, good and gracious Heavenly Father, who commands your people not to oppress the poor with usuries and extortion, who takes as a loyal servant and gives life to the man who shuns such evils, who is generosity itself. Grant us the gifts of understanding, knowledge, and wisdom, that we may discern the pernicious vice of usury, so to guide good men of good will to sound doctrine. We ask this through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God forever and ever. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. All right, so tonight, very excited. This is my favorite topic of all of the topics we've discussed, usury, and specifically trying to understand it in a modern context and trying to understand the history of this concept for, at least in the Western world. I suppose I could give another lecture on usury in the Islamic world, and in some ways it would be very similar. So it's an interesting overlap there. And so a little bit of an outline. Oops. Oh, something happened to my thing here. Yeah, I think I can fix it. I just don't know Apple stuff. Oh, here. It's just like this button, right?
Yeah, that green one.
Or I can just do this.
Yeah, over to you.
Oh, yeah. And see now I'm doing the 35-year-old boomer thing. I'm gonna cut this out of my video. Can someone tell me if there's a red line on that the red button is activated on that phone back there on the other side? I'm gonna cut this out.
I think we want to record this.
Yeah, this is great. Yeah.
Okay. The little red button's pushed on the right?
Start.
Well, there's a timer at the bottom, so
Okay.
I'm assuming
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
running.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep it, but
Oh, yeah.
I'm not going to put it on the Institute's website. There's no way. Not a chance. All right.
Certainly under no program.
Well, they keep telling me I'm supposed to be professional, so yeah. It's difficult for me. I'm kind of a redneck. Yeah, well, yeah. It's a trolley doll or whatever, right? Okay, so so I want to talk about usury, and especially in the modern era. We can talk about usury historically, and I guess that's fun, but I think it's better to understand it in its historical context and try to discuss it in the sense that we need to understand it today. So a bit of an outline. So what is usury? We'll talk about a definition. I think this is very important. I recently had a conversation with someone about usury, and they insisted that defining it was not all that important. I think this is ridiculous. If anyone tells you that you don't need to define something that is like a mortal sin, or at least it was, okay? And I can talk about that too. That person is not helping you in that moment, okay? They need your help. I want to talk about anti-usury law in the West and just sort of understanding what people thought about it, how the average person thought about usury up until very, very, very recently. I want to respond to some bad theological arguments. So I have a few of those that I want to respond to. I want to respond to 5 bad economic arguments. So hopefully this lecture will not go on for 3 hours. And I want to talk about the importance of addressing usury today, and a little bit about the reality that usury is very much on the mind of our current pontiff and the previous one. It is not a dead issue or whatever. It's a very important issue. And I want to start off by talking about 2 pontiffs that you may not know much about. They are from what I would say is the modern era, really. Pope Benedict XIV on the left there, and Pope Gregory XVI. Pope Benedict XIV's reign was in the mid-1700s, mid to late, and Pope Gregory XVI was in the early to mid-1800s. Okay, so they weren't Gregory XVI was not a successor to Benedict the 14th directly, but he was a few popes after. Pope Benedict the 14th gives us an encyclical purely about usury. And I've given you copies there in front of you. It's very easy to find this online. If you go to papalencyclicals.net, they have a very nicely formatted version of this. And if you look at number 3, item 1, we find a 5-part definition and sort of admonishment about the concept of usury. So 3, the nature of the sin called usury has its proper place and origin in a loan contract. Later on, he continues speaking about someone who lends money. Any gain which exceeds the amount he gave is illicit and usurious. Okay, so this strikes me as very plain language. I think Pope Benedict XIV and I would have gotten along. He's a very plain speaker, it seems. The context of this encyclical is that initially it was written only for the bishops of Italy. And so if you look at it, it's addressed to them. And you can see the English title is on usury and other dishonest profits. So we get a pseudo definition right there in the title, right? Usury is a dishonest profit, okay? And again, this is 1745, okay? I want to try to set the stage. This is 1745, okay? We're knocking on the door of coal and the steam engine and the use of oil, right? We're knocking on the industrial age. This is not far back in history, okay? This is not the Stone Age. This is not Braveheart, okay? This is not even St. Thomas Aquinas, okay? This was 500 years after St. Thomas Aquinas, okay? This is the modern era. So the idea that usury is some relic of the past is just silly. The Holy Office under Pope Gregory XVI in 1836, actually I believe July 29th, 1836, the Holy Office made this encyclical applicable to the whole world, not just to the Italian bishops. Okay, so it's an encyclical, it's applicable to the whole world, it clearly defines usury. This is very helpful. Okay. Part 2 under number 3 there, one cannot condone the sin of usury by arguing that the gain is not great or excessive, but rather moderate or small. Okay? So, the modern definition of usury, such that there is a clear definition, is often given to us like, well, it's some high percentage, or payday lenders are usurers. I would agree, but so is pretty much every other lender. Okay? It's very clear. Again, it's very simple. This is not a complicated thing. This is not there's not a lot of chin pulling necessary to understand this. Okay. On number 10, much later in the document, although the document is very, very short, he says, "We exhort you not to listen to those who say that today the issue of usury is present in name only, since gain is almost always obtained from money given to another. How false is this opinion, and how far removed from the truth?" Exclamation point. My goodness. A pope with an exclamation point? Man, that must be pretty serious. And how often do we hear this, right? If we hear about interest and lending and usury, if we hear about usury at all, we exhort you not to listen to those who say today, the issue of usury is present in name only. In other words, nominalism. William of Ockham, okay, this sort of the beginning of the decline of philosophy, okay, in the Western world. He leads us to Martin Luther and the Protestant Revolution, okay, and this we have the French Revolution, okay. There's a lot of philosophical stuff behind this, but you can see what he says. Gain is almost always obtained from money given to another. Oh yeah, well everybody does it, so therefore it's okay. Man, isn't it great when a pope says no to something like that? That is fantastic, right? When we hear something, an admonishment against something like that. As far as I've been able to find, and even reading other people who have written on this issue, this is the last official document the church gives us that defines and clearly condemns this practice. Okay? So we get a lot of other discussion about how evil it is, but there's no definition given to us after this. Okay? So there's a lot of, it's definitely a modern issue. It's certainly something that Pope Francis and others have talked about, but it's not defined for us. I want to note a couple things. Usury is not a sin of the borrower, okay? We can think about this in two contexts. A borrower who is like an individual borrowing for their own consumption. That person is not a usurer, okay? That person might be imprudent or not being conservative with their means, right? Not living within their means. We can accuse them of not being frugal, okay? But that's not usury. It's a sin of the lender, okay? It's charging interest on a loan. In a business sense, the idea of usury is that the way Vix Prevent It, and Vix Prevent It goes into this very well, because the issue that the Pope is adjudicating is in a specific business context. But what he says is that, look, in a business context, we have risk in the business, okay? There's some uncertainty about whether the operations of a business will be fruitful and generate revenue in excess of the cost of the business, okay? And if someone who invests in a business like that shares in that risk, okay, then they're not being usurers, okay? This is what we call today a partnership. At the time, they didn't really have this language, okay? And so Pope Benedict XIV is sort of operating without a lot of the modern financial language that we have. But he goes out of his way to say, look, if you share in the risk, it's fine. The definition of debt, though, or one of the definitions of debt in a business context, is that you don't have the risk of the business. Interest in an accounting sense, anybody taken an accounting class in here? Yeah. Is interest an expense item on the income statement? You bet it is. It's part of the calculation of the cost of the business. It's not a sharing in the risk of the business. And now someone might say, well, there's default risk. What about that? It doesn't matter. Default risk, the chance that someone might not pay you, is not the same thing we're talking about when we're talking about business risk. Okay? The business itself is what's generating the return. Okay? This thing here, this $10 bill, this is inert. This thing cannot generate a return. Okay? This laptop could generate a return on something, right? We could do some kind of business. We could move things about from one place to another. We could retail things. I was going to bring a wrench, but I forgot to bring one. If I have my wrench, I can use my wrench. I can be productive with that. I can fix Olivia's car, right? That's productive. This thing is not productive, and it never can be. It can move resources from one place to another, but the resources themselves are what's being productive, not this. Okay? Hopefully that difference is clear. So how do we get here? How do we get to the point where even the currency we have in the early 1800s, Pope Leo XII refers to the currency we have as little better than slavery, okay? Because the currency itself is a loan. That's what this is. How do we get to the point that nearly all Catholics believe a specified error when it comes to usury? So it's even worse in a sense than the problem of Catholics not understanding the doctrine of the Eucharist. Okay? Now that's really bad. But this is different in the sense that there's an explicit document of the church right there in front of you that we all have access to that specifically says usury is this thing and usury is a great evil. Okay? But we believe, a lot of us, the exact opposite. We say, no, whatever Pope Benedict XIV said, no, that's okay. Whatever he said, that's not right. Okay. How do we get to this point? It's awful. Okay. There's a great way to look into the mind of someone in the same sort of era that Pope Benedict XIV is writing Vix Prevenit, that shows us what the early modern period thought about this concept. If you've ever seen The Merchant of Venice, okay, it's a play by William Shakespeare. He was writing, I think, in the 16th century, late 16th century, early 17th. So this is the modern era, okay? This is the early modern period, if you're in literature. I'm not, but I just know that little tidbit, okay? This is a scene. This is Act 1, Scene 3. This is a little shot from that scene in the 1973 English production of this. It was sort of televised. It was a movie. And you can find this one on YouTube for free. You can also find the 1972 version. The 1972 one, people aren't dressed like it's 1891. They're dressed like it's 1560, and they have all the floofy stuff on, right? So you can pick either one of those. I would not watch the versions that were made in the early 2000s. Like many other things that happened in the early 2000s, besides all of you being born, it's an awful thing, okay? Don't watch it. Watch these older ones. And this one features Laurence Olivier, you can see there in the middle, and what's her name? Joan Plowright. And both of them are very good in this movie. So I think you should watch it. But this movie is not about usury, really. It's a romantic comedy. It's sort of a jokey kind of thing. It's maybe the only romantic comedy I watch by myself without my wife telling me to do it, right? But this scene is very important. It's at the beginning. And Antonio, who's facing away from us here, and his friend Antonio is a wealthy merchant, okay? But all of his money is tied up on a few voyages that are happening right then and there. And he, I can't remember his friend's name for the life of me, but his friend needs a loan. He needs some money to go somewhere, to make a trip. And so they go to Shylock, who is an opponent of Antonio. They're not buddies, okay? And they're having a conversation here about Antonio and his preference for loaning money to people. Okay, he lends money to people and he doesn't expect anything above the principal back. Okay, so he's following what Christ said, lend expecting nothing in return. Okay, so there's no return on it. It's just, he's just getting back what he bought, what he lent out. Shylock says, aha, I'm very cunning and I'm very smart. And he talks about how he makes his money multiply. And he refers to, it's very interesting, he refers to Jesse, right? Shylock is Jewish, okay? And Antonio is a good Catholic from back then, right? Or whatever. Shylock says, Father Jesse, he had his ewes and rams, he had his sheep, and he was very good at making them multiply and have lots of them. And I'm doing nothing different, I'm just doing it with my money. Okay, that's what he says. And Antonio responds, this was a venture, referring to Jesse, referring to the sheep. Okay, this was a venture, sir, that Jacob asked for. Sorry, Jacob, not Jesse. A thing not in his power to bring to pass, but swayed and fashioned by the hand of heaven. Was this inserted to make interest good? In other words, he's questioning Shylock. Why is he equating sheep, which God has given us as a productive thing, okay, as animals that reproduce, and we can tend to them properly, we can husband them, and we can get our sustenance from them, and we can get our clothing from them. Not so with this, Antonio says. Or is your gold and silver ewes and rams? And so Antonio's showing us how absurd this is. This is not a ewe and a ram. This thing is inert, right? Shylock says, I cannot tell. I make it breed as fast. Later on in this exchange, Antonio says, he refers to the concept of barren metal. He has another interesting way to think about what's going on here. Now, why am I bringing this up? It's not because I'm a big fan of romantic comedies, okay? It's because, in my mind, this is a very clear indication of the way people thought about this stuff. So, this whole lending contract and everything, it bears on the story, okay? And if you've ever heard of the phrase of like a pound of flesh, okay, that's where that comes from. It comes from this play. If you hear not all that glitters is gold, that comes from this play. It's, look, Bill Shakespeare, he's not going to come up with something that's outlandish and weird and ridiculous to distract the audience, right? He wants them to focus on Portia, the beautiful princess and all of this, okay? He doesn't want you to focus on how bizarre this is, because it's not bizarre. It makes perfect sense. This was a fight that was happening at the time. The Western world had moved away from a very clear understanding of usury. We had started to allow people to do this sort of thing. Powerful families in Italy had started to do it. They'd started to build institutions that were, kind of skating things a little close to the line, okay? Sorry, I'm behind here. No, I'm not behind. I don't want to get ahead of myself. So, okay, to make this point clearer, there's a historian named Brian McCall. I prefer to read papers because they're shorter and they sort of get to the point. But he has a great book from 2013 on usury, and it's history. He's a legal historian, and he's trying to help us understand the legal history of this thing. And from his paper, he has a paper called Unprofitable Lending, Modern Credit Regulation, and the Lost Theory of Usury. And that's a long title for a paper, right, Mark? He explains that payment beyond principal can only be accepted under the following circumstances. So he's talking about the medieval world. He's talking about the way the law worked when the church had tremendous influence over how the law worked, okay? Before Occam, before Luther, okay? So, asking the medievals, when can someone charge something above the principal on a loan? When the payer is late, when the borrower is late on their payment, or some other actual damage, okay? There were two phrases, I don't have them here, but one of them is lucrum cessans. I can't, it's Latin, I don't know. But the point is that it's referring to actual damages. And Mark's a lawyer, you know what actual damages means, right? So it's not, well, I could have done something else with this money. Okay, we're going to get to that in a minute. It's not that. It's actual damages. What did you actually cost me? Okay? Not some figment of my imagination, an actual damage. Annuities are allowable. An annuity is where, let's say, I give Mary $100,000, and then over the next 20 years, she gives me an amount of money each year, the total of which would exceed $100,000, okay? So such an annuity is allowable, but the payment has to fluctuate in accord with what McCall refers to as the fruitful base. And the fruitful base being the firm, the activity of the company. Government bonds are allowable based on the power to tax. Mark, do you have something?
Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
That we have to come back to.
Okay, sure. Government bonds, so governments can charge interest because it's sort of a species of their ability to tax. Okay, it's a version of their ability to tax. Sales on credit or future sales. So he's saying that at the time, we understand that if if I'm going to sell Nathan something a year from now, so we agree today to a sale of something later, that we might agree to a price that's above the current going rate because we're uncertain about how things will look in the future. Okay? So this uncertainty is allowable in some context. Okay? Partnerships or equity arrangements which aren't loans in the first place. So if Mark and I partner into a business, it's not the same thing as a loan. Okay. So how about some bad theological arguments? And I'm not a theologian, okay? But I try. So the first, yeah, we all do, right? So development of doctrine, I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about bishops. I'm going to talk about the nature of money. Let's see. Well, I thought I had more slides there. But, okay, well, so the first one is development of doctrine. So first of all, this idea of development of doctrine. So, the teaching of the church changes over time. Okay, this is what we're told. And so the sense in which this is legitimate is that the church comes to a better understanding over time about how the deposit of faith is given to us. Okay, we get a better understanding of things. So I'm thinking of the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. Okay, it's not defined until relatively recently. Okay, that's development of doctrine. It cannot consist of calling something that was a mortal sin in the past not a mortal sin today, much less that it would be virtuous today. Okay. I think there's an interesting argument about this. In 1966, law professor and judge John Noonan compares this. He's writing an article about contraception, which is a big issue of the day, in terms of specifically about what the church taught, not just being a big issue in general, right? And what he does is he says, well, obviously there's some development of doctrine on usury because everybody does it, and the church, hasn't put together a crusade about it, to shut down all the banks or something. And so on that assumption, he says, well, in that case, then contraception is allowable due to various arguments that he makes in the paper. And I could talk all day about the paper, but it's very interesting because there's sort of two sides of the same coin. In Bill Shakespeare's play, Shylock makes that which is not fertile into something fertile. This is by its nature not fertile. Okay? By its nature. He denies its nature. Okay? Contraception. We take something that is fertile, the marital act is fertile, and we make it infertile. So you can see this is two sides of the same coin. The next argument that I want to talk about is that bishops have been lending for a long time, over 100 years, whatever. Bishops lend money and they take that interest and they do things with it. And so Noonan says, look, this is an indication that obviously usury has changed or something, okay? In my view, this is like arguing that denying Christ 3 times is justifiable because St. Peter did it in the Bible. Okay. So because those who are, the princes of the church, because they might do something wrong now and then, that justifies the wrong thing, this is a poor argument, okay? Now, I'm not going to go beyond my ability as a layman to say anything about this, right? This is, I'm just Joe Average Guy. What the bishops do is not my business necessarily in this context, right? So we have this silly argument that because bishops may or may not have had banks and lending arrangements, that now usury no longer means what it has always meant, okay? The last one is that the nature of money has changed. So the nature of money in and of itself. So this is sort of a philosophical argument. It's probably not a theological argument. It's probably a philosophical argument, but whatever, I'll put it under that category because it's all the same to me. I'm an economist. I don't know the difference. So this confuses a change in the nature of money for a proliferation of methods of distorting its nature. So just because there are so many ways now to distort this thing into making it productive, doesn't mean that its nature has changed. Money is a medium of exchange. It's a store of value. Right? I can get $10, I can put it in my wallet, and I can wait a year and spend $10 later. It stores value. It's a medium of exchange. If I wanted to buy a can of beer off of the table over there, maybe not $10, but you know.
10.
Yeah, this isn't an NFL game, okay? I'm not paying $10 for beer. But you see what I'm saying here. The nature of the thing is the same. It may not be the same physically as it was. It's not a gold coin with Caesar's face on it. But who cares? It's the same thing. Okay? And I think fantastic, wonderful contributions of bishops and monks and priests throughout the years that have helped us understand money. But that doesn't mean it's different. Okay? Just because we come up with lots of ways to mess with it and go against its nature doesn't mean its nature changed. So let's get to my wheelhouse here, economics. And notice the proliferation of words on the screen, right? So we'll just go through these things very systematically. So the time value of money is probably the most common, I think, defense of usury from an economic standpoint. And so the notion of time value of money is, well, $1 today is worth more than $1 in 5 years, okay? Because of its ability to, well, commonly the definition is its ability to be productive. I said earn interest. This is sort of a circular logic, okay? This is like, well, time value of money justifies usury because it defines usury in a different way. Well, no. This isn't $1 is worth more now than later. Well, that would just be assuming that that it's justifiable. That's not true. Okay? Just because that we can explain interest with growth rates and things like this, right? We can explain why someone might give up $1 to get, you know, they might give up 50 cents to have a chance at $1 in the future. It doesn't justify the usury. It doesn't get around the prohibition on the thing. Okay? Due to its ability to earn interest. I want to just point out this thing. Why is that the case? Why is this $10, according to the time value of money, this $10 is worth more now than it would be in the future, okay? And the idea is because it's able to earn interest. Well, again, this thing itself cannot do that. It has to be put to a use. The use itself is what generates the return. There is no time value of money disjointed from productive activity. Maybe that was a clearer way to say it. Inflation. Well, because there's an inflation rate, because the value of this thing is constantly eroded over time in our present circumstance, and especially in our present circumstance, because of that, that justifies charging interest. Okay. So, due to an expected steady decline in the value of the dollar, the borrower must pay more than the original principal to the lender. So we think back to McCall, and he says, paying more than the principal is justified if the borrower causes an actual damage to the lender. Okay? Here's the thing. If I borrow $10 from Madison and inflation occurs, okay, I'm not responsible for that inflation. It's not my fault, okay? I didn't cause her loss. The powers that be that run this thing caused that loss, okay? Or whoever, okay? We could blame it on anyone. We could blame it on the Easter Bunny. Doesn't matter. Get your money out of him, okay? Maybe Mark can help us with a civil suit. But I did not cause that loss, okay? Opportunity cost. So this is a very important economic concept. Opportunity cost is the highest valued next best alternative to the good chosen. So look, all of you are here. So from a purely economic sort of theoretical standpoint, my conclusion is that this is the best use of your time as judged by you when you arrived. And your opportunity cost is whatever else you could have done if you weren't here. Okay. Well, you can imagine in your head what you might have done. You can formulate a plan as to what you might have done, but you didn't do it, right? So if I lend Mark $10 and I could have done something else with this $10, that doesn't justify me charging Mark money. It's imaginary. It didn't happen. It's not a real thing. It might be a useful theoretical construct to understand how people work, but it doesn't have moral weight. Okay? It doesn't change the nature of this thing. This thing is not productive because I could have had some other use. All right. Interest versus rent. So look, hey, maybe someone who borrows this money from me, well, they're renting it from me. Let's put it that way. Let's call it rent. Let's call it a rental. So let's see. Rent is justified because productive, durable assets generate a benefit for the user and must be maintained and repaired. Well, St. Thomas Aquinas would say that this is not a durable asset, that this is consumed in its use. Okay, that's what he said. But even barring that, okay, you might disagree with St. Thomas. It's not productive. Again, in and of itself, it's not productive. If I had my wrench with me today, is that a productive, durable asset? You betcha. Am I justified in renting that to someone under certain circumstances? You bet. Now, if Madison just has a great need for a wrench, okay, I might not be justified in charging rent for that. But in a normal, sort of peaceful existence, there's some justification, there's some sensibility to rent of productive, durable assets. This is not productive. Okay. Interest versus return on equity. Well, if you understand finance well, you understand that debt and equity, they're just two sources of funds. There are two ways of obtaining capital for our business. And so we have a return on equity that we have to pay to the owner of the business. Okay, that's a sensible thing. So this is just the other side of the coin. This is just somebody else who's putting money in the business. This is just someone else helping the business out. No, that's not true. Someone who is lending to the firm does not share in the risk of that firm. They do not have a payment that's adjustable based on the vicissitudes of the productivity of that business. They are owed that money. And in fact, if we get to the point where the firm fails, okay, like say Olivia and I have a business and it fails, Mark is a lender to us. I can pick on Mark. He's tough. He's going to be first in line for the assets that we have to liquidate of our business. Right? If our business is insolvent, we fail, he's first in line because he's the lender. That's the way the rules are set up. And I think a long time. I don't think it's been different in the past. Yeah, it's always been that way. Debt is first in line.
Debt is paramount to equity.
And then after that, the two of us, if Olivia and I had had a productive business in the past, then we're afterwards. Okay. Those are bad economic arguments, I think. Okay? Again, I'm not your bishop, okay? I'm not trying to impose on you something that's binding your conscience. I'm just explaining the way things have always been. I mean, this is just, none of this is convincing in my mind as upending centuries of sensible law, okay? And if you're basing it on the changes in philosophy over time, well, you know, most of those philosophical changes have been really bad. So you'd have to, it's almost like you've got a bigger hill to climb, right? Okay. This is a picture of Pope Francis addressing a group in Italy in February of 2018. And this group is dedicated to mitigating the negative effects of usury on the people of Italy. Okay. I don't know exactly what they do, but it's instructive, I think, to understand that, number one, Pope Francis is very concerned about this sort of thing. So in Fratelli Tutti, which is one of his social encyclicals, usury feeds financialization, and he's very negative on sort of large financial interests and their imposition on cultures and peoples, okay, in this document. Financialization, in other words, the creation of this sort of financial industry that sort of sits atop the actual productive aspects of the economy. It grants undue power to large firms who are empowered to disrupt markets and impose their views on communities. So we have this idea of woke capital. I don't know if y'all have ever heard that phrase, but I think we're finding out that the mom and pop store down the street, that in some sense is inefficient, okay, because they're not taking advantage of economies of scale. Okay? Well, it turns out that those efficiencies are maybe hidden. There's a sort of cultural component to this where the mom and pop store participates in the culture. It doesn't dominate it and crush it. Okay? And Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis is very concerned about that sort of thing. Now, he's talking about the developing world, but I mean, look, if it applies to Burkina Faso, it applies to us. I don't see the difference. Okay. In this address, Pope Francis, he starts off, when he's talking about usury itself, he says, he talks about the importance of frugality and sensibility on the part of the public. So his first comment isn't about the lenders, okay? And I think this is, to some extent, sort of mirrors the sort of gap between the discussion of usury and the action on the part of the church for the last 200 years in terms of usury. Okay. So the thing he starts with is frugality. He starts with redemptive suffering. Okay. He says, hey, things are tough, and people shouldn't run to a creditor to try to make their lives easier. Okay. Now, I think he would also say they shouldn't have to. Okay. The world shouldn't operate in a sense where someone feels that they have to go there. But it's this sort of push and pull. Am I being frugal enough? How much is the system making my life unjustly bad? Where is that medium found? But for usurers, he says, for usurers themselves, you can be, so talking about these folks here, you can be a reminder of a sense of humanity and justice to make them aware they cannot kill their brothers in the name of money, which is such an interesting phrase. Kill your brothers in the name of money. This just came to me. If you look up the word usury in the Catechism, the first reference, so the first 4-digit number that it tells you to go read, is about killing people. It's about making people's lives hard to the extent that they can't live. Okay? It's interesting. Pope Francis also says, I encourage you to enter into dialogue with those who have responsibility in the field of economics and finance, so that initiatives may be promoted that help prevent usury. It means always having respect for faces, to truly put at the center the person and the family, not in words, but in deeds. So we go back to this idea of the family, right? This is something we've been talking about for quite a while. But notice that he says, it's good for these people to go to the folks in charge of the economic system in their country and to push for rules that make sense, laws that make sense. Now, what those might be, he's sort of remaining agnostic on that in this particular speech. Okay? And I think it goes to, Vatican II has a lot to say about the sort of universal call for holiness, okay, and the importance of us going to the different parts of our world, whether it's the people around us or whether it's political institutions, and having an impact on them. So I think he's encouraging them to do their civic duty here. Okay, so very far from what Noonan said, which is, that this is just not really an issue anymore. It very much is an issue. It's a very serious problem. So a solution to usury is two-pronged. Understanding Francis properly here. Frugality and the importance of work and redemptive suffering. Okay? So on the part of the borrower, while they're not usurers themselves, to the extent that they're liable for putting themselves in a position where they're participating in it, that's not a good thing. An obligation to build a system that rids the world of usury and restores right thinking on the part of politicians and the common person on the subject. And of course, to some extent, this requires that the church have, very clear teaching on this thing. And it's difficult. I think we're in a difficult position when the last time this was addressed very clearly and definitively was, a long time ago. But I think understanding this, and again, maybe I'm wrong about this stuff. Maybe there's poor arguments I've made here. I would like to hear about it so I can improve for next time, okay? Because I'm probably going to be talking about this a lot. But I think it's important, and I think that if we think about, okay, well, what happens if we get rid of usury? If I could just snap my fingers and the institutions of debt were to go away, I know this is ridiculous, but it's a sort of silly thought experiment. What would happen? Well, we might be treated to all kinds of disastrous sort of thinking. My goodness, what would happen if we couldn't lend money at interest? What would happen? People might go hungry because they don't have a credit card. Maybe. It's also potentially the case that if I'm of meager means and Madison is well heeled, she knows that I have access to a credit card, so she says, you know what? He can figure it out on his own. We take that away, maybe Madison's more amenable to the idea of helping me out in my time of need, because there isn't that readily available cash. It's not there for me, and she knows that, and I do too. Well, wouldn't the whole financial system fall apart, Mark? Wouldn't it come crashing down? We just couldn't figure out how to invest in businesses? Wait a minute, yeah, we could, because we do it all the time. It's called equity markets. It's taking a stake in the business. Now, who would be harmed by this policy? People who don't take a stake in the business, who lend and nothing else. Doesn't mean we can't allocate capital, right? This sort of macroeconomic term or something like that. It doesn't mean that at all. It means we do it differently. Might be ugly and nasty for a while, but there's no reason why it can't be done, in my mind. So, that's all I have for you, so I appreciate your time. This has been a production of the Leonine Institute for Catholic Social Teaching.